my YouTubers. So in this video, we are going to be talking about conflicting orchid information, and I wanted to name this video Orchid Misinformation or Orchid Misconceptions, but it didn't really fit because everybody has their own way of growing their orchids, and it's not necessarily that the information is wrong that you might read about. It might not be wrong, but it just might not apply to your certain situation. So that's why I'm saying conflicting information, because this is the way that I grow my orchids, and it's not the necessarily right way. There are many, many ways for growing your orchids. So that's what we're going to talk about today, and we're going to get right into it. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is flowers. Of course, everybody loves the flowers on their orchids. This is my Brassolalia Cattleya Husky Boy Romeo. And this guy bloomed recently. You guys actually probably remember because it was very, very recent that this one was in bloom. It isn't in bloom again, and I'm really, really excited because I love these flowers. They just aren't fragrant, so that's really the only downside to them, but I do love their cheery yellow color, especially in the winter time. It just makes me really, really happy whenever I see them. I only got 2 blooms out of them, out of the plant this time, and that's really to be expected because I don't fertilize in the winter time. So reduced flower count because I'm not fertilizing, but that's okay because I still did get 2 very beautiful blooms out of the whole situation. See the little heart shape there? I think that maybe that's why they named it Romeo. I don't know. But anyways, so flowers indicate plant health. And the reason I do not like it when people say that is because I've purchased many, many plants that were blooming and gorgeous, and then I get them home, and sometimes I'll repot them if I don't like the media that they're in. And lo and behold, I'll unpot and there'll just be masses of rotted roots. I've unpotted some and found earthworms, mealybugs, just all sorts of critters and junk just stuffed into a pot before. And so that's why I don't think that flowers indicate plant health. They are a small portion of the plant's health because an unhealthy plant won't necessarily bloom, but it's just one of the factors that indicates a plant's health. Now, the flowers are a really good way for determining whether an orchid has a virus. It's not always the case, but if you do have a orchid flower that has stippling or a color break, it almost looks kind of like there's no pigment in certain portions of the flower. That could be an indication that your orchid has a virus. So sometimes the flowers will indicate certain ailments that the leaves or everything else might not. But again, it's just one part of the whole enchilada. So you really have to look at all parts of the orchid. Now, when I'm looking at orchids to purchase, I look for a lot of different things. And one of the things that I really like to look for whenever I'm purchasing an orchid is a new growth, new lead, or new root tips. The green growing root tips, I'll look for that. I also look for the reddish coloring. Can you see the reddish coloring on this sheath here? I like to see a reddish purpley color on the orchid. It lets me know that it's getting enough light. I am not so worried about the brown sheath covering or the brown casing here. A lot of people think that it means the orchid is unhealthy, but these eventually will die and turn that brown color, so it's nothing to worry about. You can actually take them off because sometimes mealybugs and scale can get down in there. So eventually I do remove it, and you can see on the older ones I've removed it. But this doesn't necessarily mean that the orchid is unhealthy if it has one of these brown casings around the pseudobulb. So I also look at the pseudobulbs. If you can see here, these ones are pretty shriveled looking, and that's because I don't water it enough. But this newest lead here is nice and plump. There's no shriveling to it. So I'm not too worried about it. It doesn't mean that the plant is unhealthy, but if you see a bunch of pseudobulbs and they're all shriveled, it probably means something is going on below the media with the roots. Either they're rotting away or they're not being watered enough. Now, another thing that I look at is I'll look at the leaves. Are they clean and clear of debris? I look at the undersides of the leaves. Are there any mealybugs or scale, any sort of bugs that I can visibly see? I also look at the roots. I want to see green growing root tips again, and I want to make sure that the orchid is stable in the pot. So give it a little wiggle. If it wiggles around in the pot, it might just mean that it was recently repotted and hasn't had a chance to establish itself. It doesn't necessarily indicate that the roots are rotted and terrible. So ask the grower or ask somebody that, wherever you're buying your orchid, when it was last repotted. You also want to look at the media. Ask when it was last repotted and ask, what kind of media it was previously in. If you look at the media, it should look fresh. It shouldn't look broken down. As you can see here, this is fresh bark. This is what fresh bark looks like. It shouldn't look like soil, or it shouldn't crumble in your fingers. You can pick up a piece of the bark, see if it crumbles in your fingers. If it does, that means that it's probably going to need a repot very, very soon. When I purchased this one, it actually had just a ton of matted, and the bark had broken down so far you couldn't even tell it was bark anymore. It actually looked like soil. So I repotted it, and it sent out 2 new growths. One of them recently got done blooming, and then of course this one is now in bloom. So it was very, very happy to be out of that suffocating soil, broken down, decomposed bark. Now, repotting your orchids should really be done every 2 years, but it depends on your environment and what kind of media you're using. So now that orchid season is upon us, it's really vital that you make sure you're not just looking at the flowers of the plant. You have to look at the whole enchilada. Like I said, you have to look at the whole plant to really know if you're purchasing something that's going to have a strong immune system, or if you're going to be purchasing something that you're going to need to throw in the trash in a few weeks. I actually went to an orchid show yesterday, and I picked up this lovely little guy. I'm so excited about this one. This is a Paphinia majestic by Stanhopea genesiana. So you see there. And I picked this guy up from Marble Branch Farms, which is located in my state in South Carolina. And he said that he hasn't seen this one bloom, so he doesn't know what it's going to look like. He brought a couple of the seedlings with him to the show because he wanted to share it with everybody. He only had a few of these, so if you do go to an orchid show, get there early, because that's when all of the good deals go on, and that's when you can pick up orchids that are going to go very, very quickly. So he probably doesn't have these anymore. He only brought a few with him to the show, and he said it's a cross that hasn't been registered yet, and he hasn't seen it bloom, but it should be pretty interesting. I actually purchased a Paphinia off of eBay, and I'm waiting for that one to arrive. So I told myself that I was going to slowly ease myself into the new genus, but it looks like that didn't really work out because I just had to have this one. And the reason I chose it is because it has this new growth here. So you see this new growing lead here. And the media looks really, really good. You can see all of the media there. I can see the roots coming out of the bottom here. So the roots look good. So I didn't have flowers to necessarily tell me if this one is healthy. So look at all of the growing parts of the plant. So that's why flowers don't indicate plant health necessarily. If you're looking at an orchid that doesn't have any flowers, how are you going to determine whether or not it's healthy? So that's why you have to take into account everything about the plant that will show you whether or not it's healthy. So I look at the roots, of course. The roots, they're nice and healthy. I look at the media, it looks fresh. I look at the leaves. Some of them do have cut off tips, which could mean that there was burn or something that happened to the leaf and it looked ugly, so the grower cut it off. So you're going to want to ask about that. I did ask, and he just said that the ends burnt up a little bit, and so he cut them off. It wasn't anything to worry about. So ask the grower. The grower is your best source of information on the health of the plant. No grower wants to sell you a sick plant, so ask them. Ask them what it's potted in, how they take care of it, and everything like that. So I just wanted to show you my new orchid that I purchased, and I can't wait until it blooms. So another piece of conflicting information that I wanted to talk about is the fact that roots come out seeking moisture for the plant. And yes, I think that roots come out seeking moisture for the plant, but that's not the only thing that they come out for. It would be silly to think that roots only have one job. They have a multitude of different jobs, especially the aerial roots. The aerial roots prevent against water loss, they photosynthesize for the plant, they intake and exhale gases for the plant, they uptake moisture, they look for new spaces to put their roots to stabilize the plant. So roots have a multitude of different functions, and one of those functions is the uptake of moisture. So whenever I talk about in my video that roots are coming out to seek moisture, I do believe that is true. But it is also true that they're also coming out to stabilize the plant and all of those things I just listed. So it's not one thing that they're coming out to in search of for, but that is really why I like the modified version of the sphagnum bag, because those roots come out seeking moisture, and if you have high humidity levels, those roots are able to be hydrated, and overall the plant health will improve over time. Another piece of conflicting information is the statement you should never put your orchid in straight sphagnum moss because eventually the plant will suffocate from not getting any air. And I don't like that statement at all because I have several orchids that are grown in straight sphagnum moss and they do really, really well. This one is my Angraecum germanianum, and it struggles in the wintertime because of the reduced moisture. You can see when I first got it, it struggled last couple of winters. You can see the accordion shaped leaves there. It struggles because there's not enough moisture in the air, and it'll pick up whenever spring comes around and I'm able to put my orchids outside. But I pot this one in sphagnum moss because it keeps the root zone moisturized and hydrated. And if you're packing in the sphagnum moss, yes, there's not going to be a lot of air circulation. But if you place the sphagnum moss around the roots and don't pack it in, then there's going to be air circulation around the roots. They're not going to suffocate. And this one has a lot of aerial roots, so I'm not really worried about it suffocating. I think the reason sphagnum moss got such a bad reputation is because of the big box stores, your grocery stores, your department stores, wherever you can purchase Phalaenopsis orchids. Those ones are packed in sphagnum moss because when they are shipped over from Thailand, they need to be moisturized on that long journey. They're not stopping along the way to water the plants. So in order to keep them moisturized on that long journey, they pack the sphagnum moss really, really tightly to keep the moisture locked in. And then once they get to the store, they're not unpotted and repotted. So I think that's why sphagnum moss got such a bad reputation, because people were bringing these orchids home and then eventually, yes, they were suffocating, they were staying too moist, and the plant ended up dying. But sphagnum moss is a really, really great potting medium, and I use it on a lot of my plants. And if you're one of those heavy-handed waterers, you like to water and water and water, I probably wouldn't recommend sphagnum moss, but I do think sphagnum moss has its place in the orchid media world. It's something that is controversial. I really think it's split. Some people do and some people don't. So you just have to decide what is best for you. And that is the piece of information that you should soak your orchid first or wet your orchid roots first before fertilizing them. I have never done that. I have never wet my orchids before fertilizing them. My orchids, whenever they're dry, they get the water and the fertilizer at the same time. I do not wet them before fertilizing. I haven't had any problems with root burn or fertilizer burn or anything like that. So that's why I think that the jury is sort of split on the whole situation, because you have people that have been burned in the past. Get it? Fertilizer burn. You have people that have been burned in the past because they fertilized their orchids and watered their orchids at the same time, and they saw the effects of fertilizer burn. And then you have those folks who haven't experienced that, and so they consider it a good method, a good thing to do, to fertilize and water at the same time. So if you're using an orchid fertilizer, and I mean a fertilizer that is specific to orchids, I think it's easier to not burn them. If you're using Miracle Grow or something that's just for generalized plants, I think you kind of toe the line a bit because you're using a stronger sort of formula. And I don't use Miracle Grow or any of those other generalized fertilizers because they contain urea. And I like the specialized orchid formulas because I know that the recommended dose on the package is what I should be feeding my orchids with. So this is the fertilizer that I use. It is K-Lite Orchid Epiphyte Fertilizer from First Rays, and it gives me my nitrogen and my phosphorus, my potassium, calcium, magnesium. It's just a really, really good fertilizer. I haven't seen so many blooms in my life as I have when I use this fertilizer, so I really, really like it. I think that it does a great job of fertilizing my plants, and during this time of the year, I'm starting to increase my fertilizing because I'm starting to see new growths on all of my orchids, and literally what I'll do is I'll just take a pinch of it, put it in a spray bottle, or I'll put it in wherever I'm going to fertilize my orchid, and that's what I use. I also have this little teaspoon measuring. It also has a tablespoon, and I'll fill it up to, there should be rings on it. I don't think you guys will be able to see it, but there's 3 rings on it, and I'll fill it up to just there, and that's a 1/4 teaspoon, and that's the recommended dose for, actually it's 1/3 teaspoon per gallon at every watering. So I use a little bit more, but I use a 1/4 teaspoon whenever I'm using my full watering regimen, my water and my fertilizer. And you can see that the fertilizer itself is in granular form, and I really, really like this formulation. I just love this fertilizer. What can I say? Another common piece of information that I see being given out, I've actually been given this sort of information, and it bugs me a lot because as a new grower, you are relying on those more knowledgeable than yourself to grow your orchids. So whenever people tell you, oh, you can't grow that because you're growing your orchids in your house, just, I'll tell you where you can stick your information, and it's not where the sun shines. So I do not like that information, and don't listen to people who tell you that you can't do something. If you want to do something, go out there and do it, grow it, and let me know about it, because I like hearing those success stories when people say, oh, you can't do something. You have to have I will say you have to have a south-facing window with a lot of good light in order to grow highlight cattleyas or highlight orchids, but it's not impossible. Right now I have all of my orchids indoors, and this guy grew a sheath and a new lead and bloomed indoors. It is possible. I say grow whatever you want to grow and do whatever you want to do. Another piece of information I see being handed out a lot, is that you should cut your phalaenopsis spike to induce a second bloom. I don't like that piece of information. I don't do it. And that's because it takes a lot of energy and a lot of resources to put out a bloom spike. So when you cut the orchid spike and force the orchid to produce another one, you're basically using more energy, more resources, and exhausting the plant even more. even if you do force them to bloom again, you're not going to get as many flowers as you had the first time on that initial spike. You're lucky if you get even half of the blooms that you originally had. So that's why, another reason why I don't. I like whenever my orchid is done blooming, you can see this little phalaenopsis here. Whenever it's done blooming, I let it rest, I let it recuperate. That's the time where the orchid is going to grow new roots and new leaves and sort of, take a breather, gather itself again, and then send out another spike when it's ready. I am one of those people where I like the natural beauty, the natural look of things, and I don't like the ugly sticks that you have to, tie your orchid to in order to essentially get that aesthetic look that everybody loves, especially with Phalaenopsis. I like the pendulent, is that the right word? I like the hangy downy. I like the hangy downy. You sound so scientific, Brittany. Let me just show you. I like the natural look of the orchid. This is not spiked. I didn't have any problems with weight or anything like that. I also had an oncidium. It was a dancing lady type that sent out, tons and tons of buds. And the spike was really heavy. But if you put the orchid in a heavy pot, a ceramic pot, you really shouldn't have any problems with the spike breaking. So I really like the natural look of spikes, and that's why I don't stake them. The only time that I will stake them, and it's really because their spikes are so long and the flower is really heavy, that you will get twisty, weird looking spikes. So for Paphiopedilums, which you can see this one has a ginormous spike, I really underestimated how big it was going to be. You can see here, this is the size of the stake that I really thought it was going to, flower like here, but it actually grew all of this. And you guys can see the bud is nice and fat and it's getting ready to bloom. I'm so excited. This is the first rebloom I've had on a Paphiopedilum, so I'm very excited. But I did stake it, and I used one of the little flower clips. A lot of people say that the flower clips squeeze and cut off the circulation of nutrients and moisture, but the clip doesn't actually really squeeze the plant at all. It really squeezes the bamboo stake. If you can see here, it's wiggling a little bit. I don't want to wiggle it too much. So it's not actually touching the plant really, except to hold it up. So if you're using these clips correctly, it shouldn't be squeezing the stem, it should be squeezing the stake. So for those kind of orchids, I do use a stake. For pretty much every other orchid, I will just let them do their own thing, throw out their own spikes. You can see here, this one. It can reduce space if you have a grow space that has lots and lots of orchids and you're trying to reduce that space. It does help to stick the spikes straight up to help the growths go straight up, and that way you have more room. That's really the only instance where I can see staking a spike on anything other than a Paphiopedilum. Another piece of information that I see being given out is misting, that you should mist your orchids in order to keep them moist and humidity. And the fact is, misting doesn't add a whole lot of humidity, if at all. And I do not mist my orchids whenever I water them. I try to simulate their natural environment, and no one is going around misting these orchids in the wild. What happens is it rains and it rains and it rains. Of course, orchids come from many different regions. They grow in all sorts of different climates. But for the most part, when orchids get watered in the wild, they are drenched or soaked. So what I do is I try to simulate that by leaving them under some running water. What I do is I'll take each orchid, and yes, it does take a long time. I'll take each orchid and I'll run it under my bathtub faucet, and I'll run it there and I'll set it off to the side, get another orchid, run that one, go back to the first one, run that one again, and I'll continue in that manner until all of my orchids are watered. I am just so excited to be able to have a greenhouse one day, so I won't have to do that. But for now, I do have to rely on the bathtub method. So that's how I water my orchids. I don't mist them because it doesn't really add a whole lot. Occasionally, I will mist them with some fertilizer on their leaves and such. And I know that's another big controversial thing, getting water on the leaves, but that's just the way that I do things, and that's the way that I water my orchids. So that's another thing I want to talk about is getting water on the leaves. Everybody freaks out whenever there's an orchid that somebody's watering and they happen to get water on the leaves or in the crown. Everybody just stop everything. Oh my gosh, apocalypse now! Just kill the plant because it can't be saved. In the wild, orchids get water all over their leaves and in their crowns, and the way that they grow for epiphytes is that they hang to the side so that water will drip out. They also get a lot of good air circulation, and so that's how I grow my orchids. I actually had a video a couple months ago where I showed you guys how I fertilize my Paphiopedilum seedlings, and I was just going crazy, spraying all over the place. Just, you know. And I got a lot of comments about what happens if they rot, aren't you worried about it? And frankly, no, I'm not worried about it because air circulation is like the key to keeping an orchid happy and healthy, especially when it comes to watering. So a lot of my orchids get lots and lots of air circulation around their root masses and around their, just around the plant, and it keeps them happy and healthy. So if you have good air circulation and you're a heavy-handed waterer, I really wouldn't worry about crown rot or anything like that because that good air circulation is going to dry that water and you're not going to have to worry about it. Like I said, I get water all over the leaves. It takes care of the dust that might be sitting on them. It also takes care of any salts or anything like that build up on the leaves. So I just water them all over the place. The only thing that I avoid is the flowers. I will not water, I try not to get water on the buds or the blooms because that can affect the life of the bloom and can even make them blast sometimes. So I do avoid the buds and blooms whenever I water. Next thing I want to talk about is the spag and bag method. Of course, this is the recommendation that everybody gives for an orchid that is sick, doesn't have any roots, is trying to recover, and I have never personally had success with the spag and bag method. Now, you guys know that I love the modified version of the spag and bag. I've had great success with that. If you haven't seen that video, go and check it out now. That is a method that I've had a lot of success with, and I recommend it to any of you that have rootless divisions or orchids that are recovering. It's just a really, really good method. Basically, all it does is it increases humidity around the plant without actually getting the plant wet, because that's when you start to grow the mold and the rot and things like that. Now, another method that is used is to just place the orchid in a pot, keep it moist and in a bright location, and eventually roots will grow and the health of the plant will recover. I do like this method. Obviously, I'm using it right now, but you really have to take each orchid into account to determine whether or not it's going to work for you. For this one, I'm just going to leave it alone, and it's been like this for a while now, and it hasn't grown any roots. It hasn't done anything. It does have these new leads here, but they don't have any roots. This is a completely rootless division right now. I picked this one up for like $1, I think. It is Brasso Layla Olympic Meadows by Cattleya Bicolor Beta, and it's literally done nothing. It hasn't grown any new roots, the leads haven't gotten bigger, they haven't matured, it has done nothing. So this method sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. That's why I like the modified version of the spag and bag, but during the winter time, I tend to get lazy and not keep the sphagnum moist in those kind of situations, and so That's why I just decided to pot it and keep it moist and hope that it would grow roots. But I think this one is really going to pick up in health once it starts to get warm and I can leave it outside. So hopefully this hasn't confused you even more. This is just the way that I grow my orchids and the way that has worked best for me. And if I have confused you more, you can leave a comment down in the comment section below. I will answer it. You can also follow me on Facebook and Twitter. And as always, I love you guys, and I will see you next time.